So I was watching on Twitter the other day, there was this conversation in which this person posted what I thought was a very legitimate question. And that was, they said, every time I attend a mega church, when the pastor cries, it makes me skeptical because I wonder, do they cry at every service at that moment? And I thought that's a very good question. And so I just responded that, hey, here's how I handle it. We have 5 services here. We have different levels of services in other places. What I always try to do whenever I'm preaching, and I try to figure out, are there things in here that could be emotional? And I don't want to be necessarily caught off guard, because if you're caught off guard, if you're not very careful, it can go from a sentimental cry to an ugly cry where I can't do anything, right? And so I want to be aware of it. And then what I always tell myself is give yourself permission to go there. Never force it, but if it goes there, it goes there. And so there have been times here in which in 5 services, I've probably cried at 4 of them. And for whatever reason, in the 5th one, I didn't. And so I'm not up here trying to force it, trying to pretend like pinch myself, like bring out an onion, like in the notes, cry here. It's not that. But at the same time, I think it's very important pastorally I want to be real with you. And so to give myself permission it's okay. It's okay if you need a pause. It's okay to go in that direction at that moment. If you go in that way, let's be under control. And it's important for me, I think, because I tend to be a little bit more stoic. So I'm going to lean more toward the left side, toward the logical, right, to be a little bit more skeptical about my own emotions. We can talk about a little bit why that is and why I need to learn in that area. And so if we're looking at basically everybody in the room is going to divide into either those who need to learn to bring down their emotions into a proper level, almost like a jockey who gets upon the horse. They need to figure out how to guide their emotions properly, whereas others in the room are going to have to learn how to turn up their emotions. They live in denial of them. They don't have the language for them. And they don't understand how to get there. And you have to allow yourself to be emotional. I think gender stereotypes are not always right. There's always exceptions, no doubt. But it's not uncommon now for women to be in strong control of their emotions. And if they get it wrong, maybe it goes too far. But many men, we live in a culture where men are not trained to understand their emotions, to have language for their emotions, to be emotional. I've said before, the only place a man is ever allowed to be emotional, generally speaking, is in sports. Like there's nothing else. And so I do cry sometimes while preaching. I do cry sometimes while doing funerals. The most likely place for me to ever cry is while watching College Game Day. And when they do a really emotional story, I'm more likely to cry in that moment than any other. I baptized both of my children, never dropped a tear. But man, you give me a good story about a father and a son and a football game, and I'm weepy in that moment, right? So a lot of men need to learn to allow yourself. It's good for your kids to see it. It's good for your spouse to see it. It's good pastorally for y'all to recognize that I am not just dead inside, that there is life that's here in some ways. And so even whenever I'm doing a funeral, one of the things I do, if I'm burying somebody that I'm really close to, and I recognize, hey, this is going to be extremely emotional, right? I buried both of my grandparents, great friends throughout the years. And one thing, if I know this is going to be extremely emotional, I do everything in my power to cry the day before the funeral. I will sometimes in private then force it there. Because if you can get some of the emotion out there, then chances are when it then comes out and you're actually doing the speaking, it will be genuine, no doubt, but it won't be at the level as the first cry or as the unexpected cry. Those are in parts examples of emotional regulation. So here I'm going to try to hold back some of it so I can do what it is that I need to do. In other places, I'm going to lean into it. It's almost like a gas and a brake. Where is it that I need to press the gas here? Where is it that I need to press the brake here in order to get the car, to get my life to go where it is that I want to go? So 2 things that I want you to think of within your own life. This is far more about you than about your spouse. There's a great danger here. If you try to emotionally regulate your spouse, you will emotionally dysregulate your spouse. Recognize that. Start with yourself and then work together. It is not your job for him or her. So I want you to become curious, and I want you to become observant. And get this, both of those are about yourself. Curious about yourself. What is it that I'm actually feeling in this moment? What are the emotions that are going on? Look at it in different areas. And then observant about yourself. What's my heart rate in this moment? Where is the tension in my body? One of the things that you can do is that psychologists talk about is a body scan. That you begin at the very top of your head and you begin to scan downward looking for places of tension. So if you get a headache, where is that headache? What does your face feel like in this moment? Is there a tightening in your chest, or does it feel loose? Is your body walking around with more clenched fists, of more tightening of what's going on as the body, or are you more relaxed? So to become observant about yourself and then curious, like, all right, why is that? This headache I have, is it just caffeine? Am I not hydrated enough? Is there a stress going on in my life? It's not uncommon at all for us to carry tension in various places within our body. For many people, back pain can be not just an injury, it can be actually tension, neck pain, those kind of things. To begin to get curious of, all right, what's going on here? So I'm going to observe, and then I'm curious of what could be some causes of that. And to get the help that I actually need. So there's two lies that we've kind of already talked about here about our emotions that we want to watch out for. And the first is that they don't influence me, and the second is I can't influence them. So if you have a more avoidant attachment pathway, so if you tend to be more avoidant toward intimacy, then you're going to fall for the deception on occasions that, hey, emotions don't impact me. I'm just not an emotional person, and it doesn't really bother me. And that is a lie you're going to have to overcome. You're going to have to begin to tell yourself that, all right, emotions matter to me far more than I realize. Now let's learn about that. Whereas if you have more of an anxious pathway, you can begin to feel like you don't have control over emotions, so there's nothing you can do about them. And so the stress and the chaos that might happen, the emotional outbursts that might happen on occasion, you can think that you don't control them in any way. And many of us have the ability to go both ways. It's not uncommon at all for somebody to be completely avoidant of what's going on and to pretend like emotions don't bother me at all. And then when pressed far enough, an eruption begins to occur. That's another type of avoidance. You're trying to press away whatever is forcing that emotion out of you in that moment. It's interesting. I don't know if this is where it's going to end up, but the current research is this, that those with avoidant attachment actually feel emotion more. They just don't know it. And it could be this idea that if you have a more anxious pathway, obviously a secure pathway is good. If you have a more anxious pathway, it could be that just by being more aware of emotions, it allows you to do what I was talking about earlier, to express them. And as you express them, they might lose some of the control over you. Whereas with avoidant, maybe you're constantly stuffing it down. And the more you stuff down, the more it actually begins to control you and impact you. Or it just could be maybe based on temperament, that those with this avoidant pathway tend to have more emotions. They just have no words for them, no ability to locate it in their body. And you think about how this happens. We've talked about in the attachment class, but basically as a child, it could be that your brain just wrote the story of my needs don't matter. And over time, if your needs don't matter, it's not that your parents didn't love you. It's just life. They didn't have the skill, or they were busy, or all these things that could have taken place. But your brain wrote the story that I can't have a need because they're not going to meet it, so I have to meet it for myself. And over time, as the brain was developing, there's now just a gap to where you don't even have the ability to recognize what's going on inside of you, much less the language to do so. But thankfully, that's a process you can figure out. So let's recognize your primary pathways with emotions. I kind of already went there to some extent. So if you have a secure pathway, right? Again, if you haven't taken the attachment class, take it. Or let's have it again and take it so you know what I'm talking about here. If not, just Google it. And so this idea of a secure attachment, right? In a secure attachment, you can recognize your emotions. You can express your emotions. You can handle emotion being expressed by other people. It doesn't make you uncomfortable. It doesn't make you want to run away. It doesn't force you in. You recognize we're human beings. We all express emotions. And you use that, you leverage that in a good way to connect with other people, to understand what they need and to express the needs that you actually have. That's what a secure attachment does. An anxious attachment, now, out of fear of abandonment, an anxious attachment will now tend toward more heightened emotions. So because they're afraid of a disconnection, that causes panic within them. Their fight or flight begins to kick in, and they tend to be drawn toward fight. And so they will now literally try to come forcefully for the person that they're afraid of losing connection with, and their emotions tend to run them to some extent. Whereas if you have an avoidant attachment, generally it's a byproduct of a great deal of shame. You now want to detach from your own emotion. And so you will come across as a whole lot more left brain. Remember, left brain is logical and linear, and you have all the language, and you can argue and never really get ruffled in any way, and really just pinpoint down exactly to what you want to say. But you're actually using that rigidity to stay away from your heart. And that avoidant attachment now, it can rule what's going on. And then disorganized, which again, that tends to be a lot of childhood trauma. Just because you had childhood trauma doesn't mean you're disorganized, but if you have a disorganized attachment, you do have childhood trauma. And what that leads to is extremely erratic behavior. Unpredictable to yourself and definitely to others, these wild swings in mood where you can laugh inappropriately at one time and then shout inappropriately at another time, and nobody really can predict what your behavior is going to be, and you can't even predict it to such an extent that you really don't even trust yourself. So for a vast majority of us, though, the options, the pathways that we have before us are secure, anxious, or avoidant, and most of us can actually travel down any three of those at any time. And we can switch pathways based on what our brain thinks is going to work in the moment. So how is it that we learn how to emotionally regulate? The first task now is to recognize emotions. We have to learn to figure out what they are and to know how to identify them. So it begins by we learn to see them. So it helps as we see them in others. We can identify them in others. But then at some point we have to begin to see them in ourselves as well. And to not be shamed by them, to not be embarrassed by them, to recognize we're all emotional people, and these emotions are helping us figure out life. They're trying to keep us safe. So let's begin to identify them, actually give thanks to God for the very emotion that's there. But then we have to learn to describe them. Remember what Siegel says, you have to name it to tame it. And here's why I think avoidant attachment, why they might feel emotion more. Without the language to describe it, they have no ability to control it. And so they end up having to live in denial of it because they don't know what to do about it. So this is a chart a lot of people use. You can see it on the screen. It's kind of the wheel of emotions. And this is a tool. You can find it online. It's in a whole variety of places. I didn't have the rights to print it out for you, so that's why I didn't print it out for you. But you can look on the screen, and it takes these basic emotions that we all have, these big categories of love, fear, anger, sadness, surprise, and joy, and then it branches out from there to another layer of words that we can use to then describe what's going on in our lives. And then it branches out from there to more words that we can use to describe what's going on in our lives. And this can empower you to begin to pinpoint what's going on emotionally. Remember last semester I told you that we used a chart very similar to this when Ella was really little. We had to assist her, Down syndrome, we had to assist her to learn her own emotions, to learn the emotions of others. And even as she was learning her own emotions, she sometimes would struggle to read the emotions in other people, to know what was appropriate then of how to act toward them. And so we had something like this, but it had faces on it, right? And so we would just take the chart and give it to Ella and say, how was your day today? Pick out, right? She could put her finger down that said angry, or put her finger down that said sad or happy or whatever. And so one day I picked her up from school and I said, hey, how do you feel today? And she looked down, she pointed down, and I looked down and it said hungover. Okay. That could be an appropriate response, I guess, in some way. But one way you can use this if you want to, whenever you get home, print it out, you can take a picture of it or whatever. One thing that's an interesting exercise, I just quickly kind of did it backstage, is to go through and begin to circle the words that you commonly use. So let me be transparent here. You will never hear me say I'm angry. I don't have that capability. I'll say I'm frustrated. Why is that? What's going on there? Right? I'll never forget one of the rare times I actually did use this word is, that's funny that I'm treating the word angry as though it's a curse word. And so I was back in Arkansas. I was sitting in with our administrators. We were dealing with a situation, and one of our staff members had done something that extremely frustrated me. And so I'm sitting there. We're talking through that situation, and I used the word. I said, I think I said mad. I think I'm as mad as I've ever been in my entire life. And I said it just like that. And they started laughing. And I said, why are y'all laughing? They said, you are as calm as any person I've ever met in this moment. And yet you claim that this is the angriest you've ever been. Oh, watch out. Kevin's angry. So my brain has written the story that I am not allowed to be angry. I can't go there. And so I have to diminish it, and I have to downplay it to a level that's lower. So what is now in my head socially acceptable for me to say? If you can't say you're angry, you can't say, man, I'm really mad. What do you say? Frustrated. That's okay. Because what is it my brain is doing in that moment? My brain has written the story that if I say I'm angry, that might be too much for you emotionally. I might be too needy, and you might leave. You might be done with me. And so that begins to inhibit some of the language that I can use. Now some of you, if you live with an angry husband, you're like, dear Lord Jesus, how can we get that to be the case for my husband, right? But notice, here's the thing. The answer, so that's the byproduct and part of an anxious attachment. But the answer in these things is not to become the opposite. The answer in these things is to become secure. So here's the problem with me never saying I'm angry. It means that I am never truly communicating to those who love me most the true condition of how I feel in the moment, which means they are forever having to read between the lines to try to figure out, all right, he says he's frustrated. Okay, so he gets frustrated with a bad golf swing. He gets frustrated when somebody curses him out online. He gets frustrated whenever he is physically in danger from somebody else. Which is it that's going on here? And so my inability to go there actually puts added weight and pressure on Jenny, added weight and pressure on my coworkers, on my bosses, to figure out where I actually am. And they are actually now have the responsibility. I'm giving them the responsibility now to figure out where I am emotionally instead of just being honest with them to let them know here's where I am. So actually, in the irony of all things is in my worry and concern about becoming too needy, I actually become needy. In my desire to be low maintenance, I actually become high maintenance. And so what I have to learn to do is to say, okay, Kevin, it is okay to say that you're angry. And here's an interesting little thing for me. If we look at the negative emotions, specifically of anger and sadness, I will never use the big emotions near the center. I will use the words way outside that are kind of more downplayed. And then at the same time, if we look at the positive emotions like love and joy, I could use the word love, obviously. I don't really use the word joy unless preaching. But instead of going way out to the far reaches, I stay kind of in the center. And so whenever it comes to negative emotions, I really downplay them. When it comes to positive emotions, I just kind of moderate them. Because at no point am I comfortable in saying I'm ecstatic or happy about what's going on because it feels vulnerable. So I can't really fully be happy. I can't really fully be joyful. But I definitely can't now be angry. And so I live in this moderating world. Why? Because I'm trying to please other people. And in so doing, I'm diminishing myself. But I'm actually robbing myself and robbing others of a relationship with me. And so this is where I need to grow. Thankfully, I don't have to. I just have to teach y'all about it. So what is it for you? It might be interesting to just take a sheet like this and in private or with your spouse, just begin to circle words that you use and say, okay, is there a pattern here? And again, notice, observant and curious and observant. So I'm curious, so I'm going to print this out. I'm observant, so I'm going to go in, I'm going to circle what I observe within my own life of words I'm comfortable with, words I'm not comfortable with. Now I'm curious again, is there a pattern? Is there some sort of explanation? Is there a reason that I'm doing what I'm doing? And if so, why is that? And so if you can begin to learn now to actually see the emotions and then describe them, and then beyond that, then actually communicate them. So now as Jenny and I work together, she is assisting me, influencing me, not controlling me, but as she is influencing me, she should actually applaud me now whenever I have the courage to say I'm angry. 24 years of marriage, I don't think I've ever actually said I'm angry with her. I don't think so. And I think that makes her angry because she knows that at times I am angry. And I'm always quick to, I know I'm frustrated with the situation. And that's true. That's true. It's not her. It is the situation. But you're not frustrated. You're angry or you're sad. Could be you're sad. And men tend not to go in that direction. Men tend more toward saying that they're angry than actually saying that they're hurt. Because we live in a culture where men are not allowed to be emotionally hurt because it's a sign of weakness. And ironically, in our culture, it's a sign of strength to diminish and to lie about who you actually are. And it's considered a sign of weakness to be truthful and honest and deal with it. And how messed up is that? And so take this chart, become curious, and learn to communicate. And it might be, seriously, if you are more avoidantly attached and you don't have the language for this, and don't forget my story. In my opinion, I can switch between anxious and avoidant like that. And so if you don't have the language, literally you can take this and say, all right, here's the word that I think best communicates this in this moment. And if you're a spouse and you're wanting more communication, allow them to have that time, allow them to use this, and to recognize how this is actually can be a step forward. It's not them hiding. Instead, it's them becoming vulnerable to now say, all right, let me try this out. What does this feel like? If your spouse is frustrated that you don't, frustrated, that's hilarious. If your spouse, I can't help it. It's like saying y'all, like it's going to happen. If your spouse has talked about the tension that is now caused because you don't communicate your emotions enough, take this, print it out, put it at work, and when you're on the phone with your spouse, pick out the right word and then use that word. And what happens over time is you learn to communicate what's going on. The key ingredient here is vulnerability. So the key ingredient is vulnerability. What does vulnerability mean? Think about vulnerability this way. You have patterns in your life that at one time protected you. And that is your natural go-to action. And yet that which has protected you in the past can endanger you in the present. Vulnerability now is the courage to recognize the tendency and to try something different. That's vulnerability. And so it's very vulnerable for a person who is used to being emotionally unstable and having to seek the comfort and the regulation of somebody else. It's vulnerable for them to tell themselves the story in an anxious attachment. I don't have to run toward my partner with an avoidant attachment. I can actually learn to self-regulate myself. It's vulnerable in that moment to feel isolated and to be taking care of that on your own. At the same time, for somebody who has an avoidant pathway, who isn't used to expressing anything, it's vulnerable now to actually use some language they haven't used before, to use a word and say, all right, I'm angry in this moment. It's vulnerable now to test that out. And yet, if they will begin to lean into that new action, they'll begin to create new pathways. And the next thing you know, the person that has no language for their emotions actually begins to communicate it pretty well. And as we do this work over time, growth can begin to take place. So here's what we want to do. We want to learn to recognize both triggers and patterns. And I recognize the word trigger in our culture can mean so many things to so many different people because we're so afraid of how people are misusing this word of trigger, and as if every trigger has to be removed, right? If you say something that's now triggering to somebody else at the workplace, they might go to HR, right? And all you're doing is kind of telling your story, but that's a trigger. We have to be so careful. Here's the thing about triggers for us. You have to learn to manage your own triggers. It's not necessarily somebody else's responsibility. Now, we want to be compassionate, no doubt. As I look at stories that I'm going to tell on a weekend, even in this room, I think, all right, is this going to be hard for somebody to hear? Now, is it okay for that hardship to happen or not? And let's not be uncaring or unkind or just glib in what we're talking about. But at the same time, in the end, for me, it's not your job to worry about my triggers. And so what are triggers? Triggers are past experiences that drive present action. So we experience something in the present that triggers something from our past. And it's that past emotion, generally it's a undealt with emotion from the past, that then floods into the present and drives us to act in that moment. And if we're emotionally regulated, we don't want to be driven by emotions from the past. We want to be driven by emotions in the present. Because remember, the emotions in the past saved us then, but they could kill us now. And so we try to deal with the past as best we possibly can so that we aren't now triggered in this moment. What's the old country song? Ain't it funny how a melody can bring back a memory? You have those songs? Good and bad. You have those songs that can immediately take you to high school? For some, that's a good experience. For some, it's not. A song can be a trigger. A smell can be a trigger. Criticism can be a trigger. If you grew up with a parent who was always criticizing you, and now somebody at work critiques an action, your brain can immediately jump the shark and think they're critiquing and criticizing who you are, and it can immediately take you back to how you used to feel. And now you're not emotionally acting your age, you're acting what age you were, and are driven by that emotion. Anniversaries. I think we've all experienced that in some way. If you've lost a parent, if you lost a child. Anniversaries in a positive way can trigger strong emotion. If you're married, your anniversary comes up, that can be a very positive thing. But where there's trauma, where there's pain, where there's sorrow, when that date arises, it can trigger some emotion. But recognize the other things in life. Conflict. Some of you wonder, why does my spouse shut down in conflict? It's possible it's because he was raised in conflict. And his brain created a rightful story back then that this is danger. And maybe having never fully processed through it, now whenever you have just a regular disagreement, his body is flooded with that fight or flight that he had when he was 5. And to now look at that with compassion, instead of, again, to go back to this idea of maybe it's a lack of skill, not a lack of heart, that keeps him from being able to have that conflict in that moment. Conflict to me it's a scary thing. It broke my home up as a kid. I didn't want that outcome. My parents didn't want that outcome. And yet, to this day, it still impacts how I hear raised voices. I don't think it's any accident that you'll never hear me raise my voice in a negative way. The more frustrated I get, the more calm I become. I am most scary when my tone is monotone. Because I grew up in a different climate. It wasn't bad, but my brain wrote a proper story. This is dangerous. And so I struggle to go there sometimes. So we want to recognize what these triggers are. You know, the success of others can be a trigger. If you grew up in a home where only one child got praised, or you grew up in a place where there wasn't plenty for everybody, and so whoever got it first got it, then if you see a coworker succeed, you can immediately feel in danger of what's going on. So you have to begin to identify what are the things, again, curious and observant, what are the things that now trigger these type of emotions that go on within me? And then beyond that, you want to begin to consider what the patterns are. So let's think about this specifically in the most intimate of relationships with husbands and wives, boyfriends, girlfriends. What's the pattern of conflict that happens in your relationship? So think about it. When I do A, that leads my spouse to feel B. Notice it doesn't make her. It leads her to feel B. I'm influencing her now to feel B. And when my spouse when she feels B, she does C. But when she does C, that leads me to feel D. And when I feel D, I do E. And what's the pattern that happens here? This is one thing we talked about in previous classes. Sue Johnson says there's basically only 3 types of fights, right? We've talked about this. So learn to identify them, to step out of them and begin to say, all right, what's going on here? The most common response in this room so far in the survey of what creates the most tension in your relationship, the most common response so far is sex. Okay, why is that? Well, I think there's an obvious answer. If you go back to Genesis 2 and Genesis 3, that was the very first place that sin expressed itself. Because as Adam and Eve fell, the first thing they did was to hide and to cover themselves. And that vulnerability went away as danger began to rise. So it should be of no surprise to us that all these years later, it is still intimacy that creates the most tension between us because it is the most vulnerable of all acts. But what's the pattern within that relationship? When a fight happens over money, what's the pattern? I can almost guarantee you there's a pattern. This is one of the great benefits of counseling. As you go to a counselor, and what feels so unpredictable to you, they listen to maybe one time and go, oh, so you spent money here that y'all hadn't talked about, and then he said that, and then you felt that, so you did this, and then he felt that, so he did this, and y'all have done that your whole marriage. And you're like, how did that just happen? It's because we are far more predictable than we'd like to think. You are not, seriously, it is arrogance to believe that we are so unique that nobody can figure us out. You and I are so common that what we think are the most unique problems are as predictable as anything. And if you and I will begin to figure out how we are contributing to what's going on. Now, again, we're not forcing the other person. It's not our job to regulate them. That's their job. But we can influence it. And so now, how can we now step out of that pattern? And the next time that goes down, instead of me responding in this way, what if I respond in this way? What if I'm vulnerable? What if I now lean in and take an action I've never taken before, and instead of getting defensive or instead of shutting down, what if I emotionally lean in now and use what you're going to see here is the last idea of attachment language, and use the idea of, hey, I know this makes you feel disconnected in this moment. I feel it too. But that's not my intention. So now, instead of getting defensive, instead of fighting about the surface level stuff, what if we went below the surface first and got back to the core issue first and foremost, which is we want to be emotionally connected. We want to make sure that we trust and we respect each other. We can be vulnerable. Let's reestablish that. Now let's get into the issue actually about money. Chances are it wasn't actually about money. Chances are it was about safety. It was about respect. It was about all these things that now felt endangered. And what happens when our tensions rise, when we feel the fight or flight, when we feel that disconnection, what's happening in that moment is we are afraid. Do not allow that fear to lead you down a path you don't want to go. Feel it, but now choose a different direction. And notice within this, don't downplay what the body can do here. It's not everything. But a good night's sleep can change a lot of things. Having a snack can just calm you in some way. Exercise. What is it that I read the other day on social media? I thought it was pretty powerful. Every now and then social media has something good. It says if you're feeling sad, go for a walk. If you're feeling angry, lift weights. Well, that explains everything, doesn't it? I never feel angry. That just clarifies the entire weak situation I'm under at this moment. But that idea now of now, don't underestimate the power of deep breaths. Of if you feel yourself working up to, as the other person is talking, to breathe in, to hold it, to exhale. And in so doing, to begin to actually calm your body. If you and I can begin to, what if we just got 10% better of emotionally regulating ourselves to the extent that our partner is instead of dealing with 100% of our emotional dysregulation, is only dealing with 90%, which probably in and of itself would reduce their dysregulation by 10%, which now is reducing our dysregulation. Now, it doesn't mean we can work our way down to zero, but what would it be like if we cut it in half? What would conflict begin to look like if instead of the loud voices and the emotional shutdowns and the words we wish we never did say, what if it came back into a much more level-headed kind of conversation that is emotionally raw, but under control? That could change everything.